You think your grandmother's Christmas dinner had the same vegetables you see today at the grocery store? Back when families grew their own food, Christmas tables exploded with vegetables that have completely vanished from American kitchens. Heirloom varieties that tasted nothing like what we eat now.
And why not? They're looking forward to an important date, dinner at home with the family.
Let's look at 30 forgotten Christmas vegetables from American gardens that we desperately need to bring back. Walk into Grandma Edith's Pennsylvania garden in December 1935 and watch her digging salsify roots. This long white root vegetable looked like a thin parsnip but tasted like oysters when cooked. She planted it in spring and left it in the ground all summer and fall. After the first hard frost, she dug the roots for Christmas dinner. She scrubbed them, peeled them, and boiled them until tender. The roots cost nothing to grow from saved seeds and fed 8 people as a side dish. They tasted mild and sweet with a distinct oyster flavor that gave them their nickname. The texture was tender and smooth. Salsify disappeared from American gardens when seed companies stopped carrying it because it took too long to grow, and the roots were difficult to clean, making it unprofitable compared to faster vegetables. And modern gardeners never learned it existed. Stand beside Grandma Wilhelmina's German garden in November 1940 and see her harvesting scorzonera. This was salsify's darker cousin, with black skin and white flesh inside. She grew it the same way, planting in spring and leaving it until after frost. The black roots looked almost like thick black carrots. She peeled away the black skin carefully because it stained everything it touched. She sliced the white flesh and cooked it in butter with cream and nutmeg. The roots cost nothing to grow and served 6 people. They tasted sweeter than regular salsify, almost like artichoke hearts, with a nutty undertone. The black skin made them look exotic and special on the Christmas table. Scorzonera vanished from American seed catalogs in the 1970s when European vegetables fell out of favor and only a few heirloom seed companies still carried it, making it nearly impossible for home gardeners to find seeds. Walk into Grandma Lucia's Italian garden in December 1950 and see massive cardoon plants. These looked like giant celery plants, growing 4 feet tall with thick stalks. She planted them in spring and they grew all summer. In fall, she tied the stalks together and wrapped them in paper to blanch them white. For Christmas, she cut the stalks, peeled away the tough strings, and braised them in tomato sauce for 2 hours until tender. The stalks cost nothing to grow from saved seeds and fed 10 people. They tasted like artichoke stems, slightly bitter, earthy, with a complex vegetable flavor. The texture was tender but fibrous. Cardoon disappeared from American gardens in the 1980s, when Italian-American families stopped growing traditional vegetables and seed companies quit carrying it because it took up too much garden space and required too much work to prepare. Stand in Grandma Charlotte's coastal Massachusetts garden in March 1945 and watch her forcing sea kale. She grew this perennial vegetable near the beach where it grew wild. In late winter, she covered the plants with buckets to block out light, forcing them to produce white tender shoots. For Christmas, she cut the blanched shoots and steamed them like asparagus for 10 minutes. She served them with butter and lemon. The shoots cost nothing since the plants came back every year and served 6 people. They tasted mild and slightly nutty, somewhere between cabbage and asparagus, delicate and refined. Sea kale disappeared from American gardens in the 1950s when perennial vegetables became unpopular because they took up permanent garden space and commercial growers never cultivated it, making seeds impossible to find in regular catalogs. Walk into Grandma Agnes's English-style Connecticut garden in April 1938 and see Good King Henry sprouting. This perennial green vegetable came back every spring like asparagus. She planted it once, and it grew for 20 years in the same spot. In early spring, she harvested the young shoots like asparagus and the young leaves like spinach. For Christmas dinner, she steamed the shoots and sautéed the leaves in butter. The plant cost nothing after the initial planting and produced food every spring forever. It tasted like mild spinach with asparagus undertones, tender and slightly earthy. Good King Henry disappeared from American gardens in the 1962 when perennial vegetables went out of fashion and seed catalogs stopped carrying it because annual vegetables were more profitable to sell every year, and the Old English name sounded strange to modern gardeners. 5 forgotten vegetables that used to grow in every garden. These weren't exotic imports. They were standard Christmas vegetables that grandmothers grew from saved seeds. Keep watching because the next 25 vegetables include Native American varieties we stopped planting and European heirlooms that vanished from seed catalogs. Stand beside Grandma Gertrude's German garden in November 1942 and watch her digging parsley roots. Hamburg parsley grew like regular parsley on top, but formed thick white roots underground like small parsnips. She planted it in spring, harvested the leaves all summer, then dug the roots after frost for Christmas. She scrubbed and peeled the roots, then sliced them and added them to soups and stews or roasted them with other root vegetables. The roots cost nothing to grow and fed 8 people. They tasted like intense parsley flavor mixed with parsnip sweetness, earthy and aromatic. Hamburg parsley disappeared from American gardens in the 1972 when dual-purpose vegetables became uncommon and gardeners wanted either parsley leaves or root vegetables, not both from the same plant, and seed companies stopped carrying it. Walk into Grandma Helene's French garden in December 1955 and see her harvesting celeriac. This ugly, knobby root was celery grown for its root instead of its stalks. She planted it in spring and it grew all summer into a baseball-sized root covered in rough skin. She peeled away the thick skin, revealing white flesh inside. She grated it raw for salads or boiled and mashed it with potatoes for Christmas dinner. The root cost nothing to grow and fed 6 people. It tasted like concentrated celery flavor, earthy and aromatic, slightly nutty. Celeriac nearly disappeared from American gardens in the 1980s when French cooking fell out of home garden fashion, though it's slowly returning now in farmers' markets, but most American gardeners still don't know how to grow it or what to do with it. Stand in Grandma Frida's German garden in November 1948 and watch her harvesting kohlrabi. This strange vegetable grew a swollen stem above ground that looked like a space alien bulb with leaves sticking out. She planted it in spring and fall for 2 crops. She peeled the thick skin off the bulbs and sliced the crisp white flesh. She ate it raw, or steamed it, or added it to stews. For Christmas, she made creamed kohlrabi by cooking it in butter and cream. The bulbs cost nothing to grow and fed 8 people. They tasted like mild broccoli stems, sweet and crunchy, raw, tender and delicate cooked. Kohlrabi mostly disappeared from American gardens in the 1970s when German vegetables fell out of fashion and the strange appearance and unfamiliar name scared away gardeners who didn't know what to do with it. Walk into Grandma Carmela's Italian garden in March 1952 and see rape greens sprouting. This was the ancestor of broccoli, growing thin stalks with small florets and bitter leaves. She planted it in early spring, and it grew fast in cool weather. She harvested the young shoots before they flowered. For Christmas, she sautéed them in olive oil with garlic and red pepper flakes. The greens cost nothing to grow from saved seeds and fed 6 people. They tasted intensely bitter with a sharp, peppery bite that mellowed with cooking. Rape greens disappeared from most American gardens in the 1980s when the unfortunate name became embarrassing to say, and seed catalogs renamed it broccoli rabe or rapini. But even with new names, bitter greens fell out of favor as Americans preferred sweeter vegetables. Stand beside Grandma Rosa's garden in November 1958 and watch her cutting chicory. This looked like dandelion greens but was cultivated, with long serrated leaves that grew in rosettes. She planted it in summer and harvested in fall and winter. The cold weather made the leaves sweeter. For Christmas, she boiled the greens to remove bitterness, then sautéed them with garlic and oil. She also forced the roots indoors to grow white blanched leaves called witloof. The greens cost nothing to grow and fed 8 people. They tasted bitter and earthy, with a complex flavor that Italians loved but Americans found too strong. Chicory disappeared from American gardens in the 1970s when bitter greens became unpopular and only specialty Italian seed companies carried it, making it impossible for most gardeners to find. 10 forgotten vegetables that American gardens lost. These weren't failures. They were perfectly good vegetables that went out of fashion when seed companies decided what we should grow. Keep watching because the next 20 vegetables include storage varieties that kept families fed all winter and Native American crops we abandoned. Walk into Grandma Eleanor's New England garden in October 1935 and see her digging skirret roots. This perennial plant produced clusters of small, sweet roots that looked like tiny white carrots growing in bunches. She planted it once, and it came back every year. She dug some roots each fall, leaving the plant to regrow. She boiled the roots until tender, about 15 minutes, and served them with butter. The roots cost nothing after planting and fed 6 people. They tasted sweet and starchy, almost like sweet potatoes but smaller and more delicate. Skirret completely disappeared from American gardens in the 1942 when seed companies stopped carrying it because the roots were too small and fiddly compared to modern vegetables, and the old medieval English vegetable was forgotten entirely, though it was once a Christmas staple. Stand in Grandma Marta's garden in August 1940 and see 6-foot-tall oryx plants. This ancient green vegetable grew taller than a person, with leaves that could be green, red, or golden yellow. She planted it in spring and harvested leaves all summer until frost. For Christmas, she cooked the leaves like spinach, sautéing them with butter. The leaves cost nothing to grow from saved seeds and fed 10 people. They tasted like mild spinach with a slightly salty mineral flavor, tender when young. Oryx disappeared from American gardens in the 1960s when modern spinach varieties became standard and the tall, gangly plants seemed old-fashioned and took up too much space, and seed companies stopped carrying this ancient vegetable that had been grown since Roman times. Walk into Grandma Bridget's Irish garden in April 1938 and see Alexanders growing wild at the edge. This biennial plant looked like thick celery with dark leaves. She didn't plant it. It just grew near the coast where her ancestors had gathered it wild. She harvested young stems in spring and flower buds in summer. For Christmas, she pickled the flower buds like capers and braised the stems like celery. The plant cost nothing and fed 8 people. It tasted strongly of celery and parsley combined, almost medicinal, with a bitter aftertaste. Alexanders disappeared from American gardens in the 1950s when it was never properly introduced to American seed catalogs because it tasted too strong and bitter for American palates. Stand beside Grandma Gwyneth's Welsh garden in December 1945 and see Welsh onions growing in clumps. These perennial onions never formed bulbs but grew in thick clusters of green shoots. She planted them once and divided the clumps every few years. She cut green shoots all year, even in winter. For Christmas, she chopped them like scallions and added them to everything. The onions cost nothing after planting and fed her family year-round forever. They tasted like mild green onions, fresh and sharp. Welsh onions mostly disappeared from American gardens in the 1970s when people preferred regular bulb onions and scallions from the store, and perennial vegetables went out of fashion, though they're slowly returning now as bunching onions or scallions, but most gardeners don't know they're perennial. Walk into Grandma Hazel's Indiana garden in September 1950 and see ground cherries sprawling. These small plants produced hundreds of tiny yellow fruits inside papery husks that fell to the ground when ripe. She planted them in spring and they self-seeded forever after. She gathered the fallen fruits and stored them for Christmas. She made them into jam or baked them in pies or ate them fresh. The fruits cost nothing after the first year and produced hundreds of fruits. They tasted like sweet pineapple mixed with tomato, tropical and unique. Ground cherries disappeared from most American gardens in the 1,980 seconds when seed companies stopped carrying them because they sprawled everywhere, and the name ground cherry sounded like they grew in dirt, making them seem unappetizing even though they were delicious. 15 vegetables that vanished from American gardens, not because they didn't grow well, not because they didn't taste good, but because seed companies decided they weren't profitable enough to sell. Keep watching because the next 15 vegetables include storage crops that kept families alive all winter. Stand in Grandma Elsie's farm garden in November 1935 and see her digging mangel wurzels. These huge beets grew 3 feet long and weighed 20 pounds each. She planted them in spring to feed cattle all winter. But her family also ate them during the Depression. She sliced the roots and boiled them for an hour until tender. She served them mashed with butter for Christmas when meat was scarce. The roots cost nothing to grow, and one root fed 12 people. They tasted like mild beets, slightly sweet, watery, and bland. Mangel wurzels disappeared from American home gardens in 1945 when the Depression ended and people could afford better food and were embarrassed they'd eaten cattle feed, and seed catalogs stopped carrying them for human consumption. Walk into Grandma Martha's Virginia garden in October 1940 and watch her digging potato onions. These onions never made seeds. She planted one bulb in fall, and by summer it multiplied into 8 bulbs clustered together like potatoes. She harvested them, ate what she needed, and replanted some for next year. For Christmas, she roasted them whole or pickled them. The onions cost nothing after the first planting and multiplied forever. They tasted like mild, sweet onions, perfect for roasting. Potato onions disappeared from American gardens in the 1,960 seconds when modern onion varieties from seeds became standard, and the old multiplying varieties were forgotten, and seed companies didn't carry them, because you couldn't sell new bulbs every year if they multiplied forever, making them unprofitable. Stand beside Grandma Vera's garden in June 1948 and see walking onions growing. These bizarre onions grew tiny bulbs on top of their flower stalks instead of seeds. The weight made the stalks bend over and plant the bulbs a few feet away, making them walk across the garden. She planted them once and they walked forever. She harvested the top bulbs and the underground bulbs. For Christmas, she pickled the small bulbs. The onions cost nothing and multiplied forever without any work. They tasted like strong shallots, sharp and pungent. Walking onions disappeared from most American gardens in the 1,970 seconds, when novelty vegetables went out of fashion, and most gardeners never learned they existed, though heirloom gardeners are slowly bringing them back now. Walk into Grandma Colette's French garden in May 1952 and see sorrel growing in thick clumps. This perennial green came back every spring before anything else. She planted it once and harvested leaves for 20 years. The leaves were arrow-shaped, bright green, and grew fast in cool weather. For Christmas, she made sorrel soup with cream and butter. The leaves cost nothing after planting and fed 8 people. They tasted intensely sour and lemony, almost shocking, the sour taste coming from oxalic acid. French sorrel disappeared from most American gardens in the 1,980 seconds, when French cooking went out of home fashion, and the intensely sour taste seemed strange to Americans who preferred milder flavors, and seed catalogs stopped carrying it except in specialty French sections. Stand in Grandma Angelina's Italian garden in November 1955 and watch her harvesting fennel bulbs. This wasn't the wild fennel that grew like weeds. This was Florence fennel, bred to form thick white bulbs at the base. She planted it in summer and harvested in fall before frost. She sliced the bulbs thin and ate them raw in salads or braised them with olive oil for Christmas dinner. The bulbs cost nothing to grow and fed 6 people. They tasted like licorice, sweet and aromatic, crunchy, raw, and tender cooked. Florence fennel mostly disappeared from American gardens in the 1972 when Italian vegetables went out of fashion, and the strong anise flavor was too intense for most Americans, though it's slowly returning now in upscale farmers' markets. 20 forgotten vegetables. These were standard Christmas vegetables that every grandmother grew. Keep watching because the final 10 vegetables include Native American varieties we stopped planting and European heirlooms that modern gardens need back. These are the vegetables that could save American garden diversity. Walk into Grandma Dorothy's Midwestern garden in November 1938, and you'd see Jerusalem artichokes towering 10 feet tall along the back fence, their yellow sunflower-like blooms still bright against the gray winter sky. These sunflower relatives weren't grown for their flowers. They produced knobby, ginger-shaped tubers underground that Grandma Dorothy called the garden's insurance policy. She'd planted just 6 tubers in 1920, and they came back every single year after that, spreading through the soil like underground soldiers. By 1930, she had enough to feed her family of 8 all winter long. She couldn't get rid of them if she tried, and honestly, she didn't want to. The plants were indestructible, surviving droughts, freezes, and her husband's attempts to plow them under. Every November through February, Grandma Dorothy would dig tubers from the frozen ground, pulling up enough to last weeks. For Christmas dinner, she roasted them like potatoes, tossing them with butter, salt, and rosemary until their skins crisped and their insides turned soft and creamy. She'd make them into thick winter soups with onions and cream, or slice them thin and fry them into chips that her grandchildren fought over. The tubers tasted like a cross between artichoke hearts and water chestnuts, nutty, mildly sweet, with a firm texture that held up even after long cooking. They cost absolutely nothing to grow, required 0 care, and produced food forever. Grandma Dorothy would give bags of tubers to neighbors every Christmas, spreading them through the neighborhood like wildfire. But Jerusalem artichokes disappeared from American gardens by the 1972 for 2 embarrassing reasons. First, the tubers contained high levels of inulin, a carbohydrate that human digestive systems couldn't break down properly. Eating too many caused severe gas, bloating, and stomach cramps, earning them the cruel nickname fartichokes. Grandma Dorothy's family loved the taste, but dreaded Christmas dinner's aftermath, a night of digestive misery nobody wanted to repeat. Second, the plants spread too aggressively, sending underground runners everywhere and popping up in lawns, flower beds, and vegetable patches where they weren't wanted. Gardeners grew tired of fighting the invasion. By 1975, Grandma Dorothy stopped planting them after her daughter-in-law complained they'd ruined half the backyard. Today, Jerusalem artichokes are sold in fancy stores as sunchokes for $6 per pound, but most gardeners still won't touch them, remembering the gas and the chaos. Stand beside Grandma Marguerite's French garden in December 1925 and watch her kneeling in the cold mud, digging for Chinese artichokes with her bare hands. These strange little plants produced tiny, spiral-shaped white tubers that looked like fat caterpillars or segmented larvae, each one barely 2 inches long and as thick as your thumb. She'd planted a handful in spring, and by December, the plants had spread underground, producing hundreds of these odd tubers that she'd harvest after the first frost sweetened them. But here's the problem. Each tuber was so incredibly small and fiddly that it took Grandma Marguerite hours to gather enough for one meal. She'd spend entire afternoons on her knees, digging through frozen soil, filling a basket with tubers that looked more like garden pests than food. Cleaning them was even worse. The tubers had deep ridges and grooves that trapped dirt in every spiral, making them nearly impossible to wash properly. Grandma Marguerite's solution was brutal but effective. She'd dump the tubers into a bowl with coarse salt and scrub them by hand until the thin skin rubbed off, leaving her fingers raw and aching. After an hour of scrubbing, she'd finally have enough clean tubers to sauté in butter with garlic and parsley for Christmas dinner. The tubers cost nothing to grow, but they fed only 4 people because they were so damn small. Each person got maybe a dozen tubers on their plate, a pile that looked impressive but amounted to just a few bites of actual food. But the taste? The taste made it almost worth the effort. Chinese artichokes were crunchy like water chestnuts, slightly sweet like Jerusalem artichokes, with a nutty flavor that held up beautifully in butter. They stayed firm even after cooking, giving them a satisfying snap when you bit down. Grandma Marguerite's family loved them, but nobody wanted to help dig or clean them, so the work always fell on her. Chinese artichokes disappeared completely from American gardens by the 1950s, and the reason was simple: they were too much trouble for too little food. The tedious cleaning process and tiny size made them impractical compared to modern vegetables like potatoes or carrots that you could grow, harvest, and cook in a fraction of the time. Seed companies stopped carrying them because they were too labor-intensive for commercial production. No farmer wanted to spend hours scrubbing tubers the size of their pinky finger. By 1960, most Americans had never heard of Chinese artichokes, and the few gardeners who remembered them refused to grow them again. Grandma Marguerite gave up on them in 1948 after her arthritis made scrubbing impossible, and she switched to growing regular potatoes instead. Boring, but at least she could clean them without crying from the pain in her hands. Today, Chinese artichokes are nearly extinct in America, surviving only in a handful of specialty farms that sell them to fancy restaurants for $20 per pound. A price that reflects the nightmare of harvesting and cleaning these beautiful, delicious, utterly impractical tubers. Walk into Grandma Greta's German garden in October 1930 and you'd see rampion growing in neat rows along the south fence, tall, slender plants with delicate purple bell-shaped flowers that bobbed in the autumn wind. This biennial plant was Grandma Greta's favorite because it gave you 2 harvests: edible roots the first year and edible leaves and flowers the second year if you let some plants go to seed. She'd plant rampion seeds every spring, let the plants grow through the hot summer, and dig the roots in fall before the ground froze. The roots looked like small white radishes or pale carrots, each one about 4 inches long and as thick as 2 fingers. She'd harvest enough to fill a bushel basket, storing them in her root cellar alongside turnips and beets. Grandma Greta ate rampion roots raw in winter salads, slicing them thin and mixing them with vinegar, oil, and dill. The roots were crisp and refreshing, tasting like mild radishes with a slightly nutty, almost sweet finish that made them perfect for cutting through the heaviness of German winter meals. For Christmas, she'd pickle the roots in jars with vinegar, garlic, and mustard seeds, creating a tangy side dish that lasted for months and paired beautifully with roasted pork and sauerkraut. The roots cost nothing to grow, required almost no care, and fed her family of 6 all winter long. She'd also eat the young leaves in spring salads before the plants flowered, getting 2 full meals from one crop. But rampion disappeared entirely from American gardens by the 1942, and the reasons were frustratingly simple. First, the only place most Americans ever heard the word rampion was in the fairy tale Rapunzel, where a pregnant woman craves rampion so badly that her husband steals it from a witch's garden, resulting in their daughter being locked in a tower. The fairy tale made rampion sound exotic and mythical, not like a real vegetable you could actually grow and eat. Most American gardeners assumed it was made up, like magic beans or golden apples. Second, seed companies in America never carried rampion because it wasn't popular enough to justify production. European seed catalogs listed it regularly, but American companies focused on vegetables that sold in bulk: potatoes, carrots, beans, not obscure biennial roots that required patience and took 2 years to fully mature. Without access to seeds, even gardeners who wanted to grow rampion couldn't find it. Stand in Grandma Maria's New Mexico garden in November 1940 and watch her digging Aracacha roots from the dry, sandy soil. This South American root vegetable produced clusters of thick white and yellow roots that grew in bunches like fat fingers reaching down into the earth. She'd planted root divisions back in spring, small sections of last year's roots that she'd saved in her cellar over winter, and by November, each plant had produced 5 or 6 heavy roots, each one as thick as her wrist and nearly a foot long. The roots looked like fat, pale carrots, but they were much starchier and denser, with a texture closer to potatoes than anything else. Grandma Maria would spend hours digging them up carefully, making sure not to break the delicate roots, filling baskets that she'd haul back to her kitchen. She boiled Aracacha roots and mashed them like potatoes, mixing them with butter and milk until they turned smooth and creamy. The mash tasted like a strange hybrid, part celery, part cabbage, part potato, with a starchy, slightly aromatic flavor that her family either loved or hated, with no in-between. For Christmas, Grandma Maria made Aracacha into thick soups with pork, hominy, and red chilies, the roots breaking down into the broth and thickening it naturally. She'd also cube the roots and add them to stews, where they absorbed flavors beautifully and held their shape better than potatoes. The roots cost nothing after the initial planting, and one harvest fed her family of 8 for weeks. But Aracacha disappeared from American gardens by the 1962, and the reasons were practical and geographic. First, South American vegetables like Aracacha, oca, and uluco never caught on in mainstream American gardening because most Americans had no cultural connection to them. They didn't appear in Betty Crocker cookbooks or Burpee seed catalogs, so gardeners saw no reason to grow them when potatoes and carrots were easier and more familiar. Second, Aracacha required warm climates with long growing seasons, at least 8 months of frost-free weather, which limited where it could grow. It thrived in New Mexico, Southern California, and parts of Texas, but it failed miserably in the Midwest and Northeast, where early frosts killed the plants before the roots matured. Grandma Maria stopped growing Aracacha in 1958 when a late spring frost killed all her root divisions, and she couldn't find anyone who still had viable planting stock to replace them. Seed companies didn't carry Aracacha because it couldn't be grown from seeds reliably. It had to be propagated from root divisions, which made commercial production nearly impossible. Without a network of gardeners saving and sharing roots, the vegetable simply died out. By 1970, Aracacha had vanished from American gardens entirely, surviving only in South America, where it remained a staple crop. Today, you can sometimes find Aracacha roots in Latin American grocery stores, imported frozen from Colombia or Ecuador, and sold for $4 per pound. But fresh Aracacha grown in American soil? That's gone. The roots that fed Grandma Maria's family every Christmas are now just a memory, killed by geographic limitations and America's refusal to embrace vegetables that didn't come from Europe. Walk into Grandma Carmen's California garden in December 1950 and watch her harvesting yacon roots, pulling up massive plants that stood 7 feet tall, with broad green leaves that looked like sunflowers gone wild. This Andean plant was a showstopper in the garden, towering over everything else, but the real magic happened underground. Each plant produced clusters of large tuberous roots, some as big as sweet potatoes, weighing 2 or 3 pounds each, that grew in tangles beneath the soil. Grandma Carmen had planted root divisions back in spring, small knobby pieces she'd saved from last year's harvest, and by December, after the first frost had knocked down the tall stalks, she knew the roots were ready. She'd dig carefully around each plant, pulling up 5 or 6 enormous roots per plant, enough to fill a wheelbarrow. The roots were crisp and juicy like apples, with thin brown skin that peeled away easily to reveal pale yellow flesh underneath. Grandma Carmen would slice them thick and eat them raw, right there in the garden, crunching into them like fresh fruit. They tasted sweet and fruity like a cross between a crisp apple and a slice of watermelon, with a refreshing juiciness that made them perfect for hot California afternoons. For Christmas, she'd peel and cube the roots, then bake them with butter, cinnamon, and brown sugar until they caramelized, creating a sweet side dish that tasted like candy but came straight from the ground. The roots cost nothing after the initial planting, and one harvest fed her family of 10 with plenty left over to share with neighbors. But here's the catch. Yacon roots didn't taste sweet right after harvest. When freshly dug, they were starchy and bland, almost flavorless. Grandma Carmen had to cure them by spreading the roots out in the sun for 2 to 3 weeks, letting the starches convert into natural sugars. She'd lay them on wooden boards in her backyard, flipping them every few days, waiting patiently while the roots slowly sweetened. If she skipped this step, the roots were inedible, boring, and textureless, like chewing on wet cardboard. Yacon never became common in American gardens because most gardeners didn't have the patience or knowledge for the curing process. They'd harvest the roots, taste them immediately, decide they were terrible, and rip out the plants in frustration. The vegetable also required a long growing season, at least 6 months of warm weather, which limited where it could grow. It thrived in California and the Southwest, but failed in colder climates where frosts came early. Grandma Carmen stopped growing yacon in 1965 when her knees gave out and she could no longer spend weeks bending over to flip roots in the sun. By 1970, yacon had disappeared from American gardens entirely, remembered only by a handful of South American immigrants who mourned the loss of the crisp, sweet roots that tasted like fruit but grew like potatoes. Yacon syrup is sold in health food stores for $15 a bottle, marketed as a low glycemic sweetener, but nobody remembers that the roots themselves were once eaten fresh, cured in the California sun until they turned into nature's candy. 25 vegetables that American gardens lost, some from Europe, some from South America, some native to North America, all forgotten when industrial agriculture decided what vegetables Americans should eat. The final 5 vegetables are the most important ones we need back in our gardens today. Stand in Grandma Inez's Andean immigrant garden in Colorado in 1945 and see mashua vines sprawling across the ground like wild nasturtiums, their bright orange and red flowers blazing against the Rocky Mountain sky. This South American tuber crop grew aggressively, sending vines in every direction, climbing over fences and choking out weeds with thick, round leaves that smelled peppery when you crushed them. Grandma Inez had brought mashua tubers from Peru in 1920, smuggling them in her luggage wrapped in newspaper, and she'd planted them every spring since then. By November, after the first frost had killed the vines, she'd dig up the tubers, knobby, irregular things in wild colors. Some were deep purple, others bright yellow, and some were striped white and red, all growing on the same plant like a box of mismatched marbles. She'd harvest enough tubers to fill a burlap sack, each one about the size of a small potato, but shaped like a twisted finger or a lumpy kidney. Grandma Inez boiled them until they were soft, then mashed them with butter and salt, or she roasted them whole in the oven until the skins blistered and the insides turned creamy. For Christmas, she made them into a spicy side dish, mixing the mashed tubers with agey peppers, garlic, and vinegar, creating a fiery accompaniment to roasted lamb that made her grandchildren's eyes water. The tubers cost nothing after the initial planting and fed her family of 8 all winter long. But here's the thing nobody wanted to talk about. Mashua had a reputation. In the Andes, farmers had been feeding mashua to male workers for centuries because they believed it reduced male libido and kept men focused on work instead of women. Whether this was true or just folklore didn't matter. The rumor was enough to make American men refuse to eat it. Grandma Inez's husband wouldn't touch mashua after a neighbor joked that it would turn him into a eunuch, and her sons followed suit, leaving the women to eat the tubers alone. Even if you ignored the libido myth, mashua's flavor was a problem. The tubers tasted intensely peppery and sharp, like horseradish mixed with raw radish and a hint of potato, with a mustardy bite that lingered on your tongue long after swallowing. Most Americans found the flavor overwhelming and unpleasant, especially compared to the mild, comforting taste of regular potatoes. Kids spat it out, and adults politely pushed it around their plates. Mashua never established itself in American gardens because seed companies and nurseries refused to carry it. The combination of its controversial reputation, its aggressive growing habit, and its polarizing flavor made it a commercial non-starter. Grandma Inez stopped growing mashua in 1952 when she couldn't find anyone willing to eat it anymore, not even her own family. She dug up the last of the tubers and fed them to her chickens, who didn't care about libido myths and devoured them happily. By 1960, mashua had vanished from American soil entirely, surviving only in Peru and Bolivia, where farmers still grew it for livestock feed and traditional medicine. The peppery, colorful tubers that once fed Grandma Inez's Christmas table were gone, killed by fear, rumor, and a flavor too bold for American palates that preferred their potatoes bland and their vegetables free of sexual side effects, real or imagined. Walk into Grandma Esperanza's mountain garden in New Mexico in 1938 and see uluco plants sprawling low to the ground, their thick, waxy leaves glistening in the high-altitude sun. This Andean crop thrived in the cool mountain air where Grandma Esperanza lived at 7,000 feet elevation, producing small, colorful tubers underground that looked like jewels when she dug them up in late fall. The tubers came in wild colors: bright pink, sunshine yellow, deep orange, and even speckled combinations, each one about the size of a walnut or a small egg. She'd planted small tubers back in spring, saving the tiniest ones from last year's harvest, and by November, after nearly 8 months of growing, each plant had produced a handful of these vibrant little tubers clustered just below the soil surface. Grandma Esperanza would boil the tubers whole, skins and all, until they were tender, then serve them alongside roasted goat or pork. She'd also slice them thin and add them to stews, where they'd break down slightly and thicken the broth. The tubers had a mild, slightly tangy flavor, earthy like potatoes, but with a hint of lemon or sorrel that made them taste brighter and fresher. For Christmas, she made them into a traditional Andean soup with corn, beans, and chunks of lamb, the colorful tubers bobbing in the broth like little edible ornaments. The tubers cost nothing after the initial planting and fed her family of 6 all winter long. But here's where uluco lost Americans: the texture. When cooked, uluco tubers released a thick, slimy mucilage, a gooey, sticky substance similar to okra slime that coated your mouth and clung to your tongue. Some people described it as snotty or slug-like, and even Grandma Esperanza's own grandchildren refused to eat it after the first time, gagging on the slippery texture and spitting it into their napkins when she wasn't looking. In the Andes, this mucilaginous quality was prized because it naturally thickened soups and stews without needing flour or cornstarch, but in America, where crisp and firm textures were preferred, the sliminess was a deal-breaker. Uluco also had serious geographic limitations. The crop required cool mountain climates with long, mild growing seasons, at least 7 to 8 months of frost-free weather with temperatures that never got too hot. It thrived in the Andes and in high-altitude regions of New Mexico and Colorado, but it failed miserably in the Midwest, the South, and coastal areas where summers were too hot or growing seasons too short. The plants would grow tall and leafy but produce almost no tubers, leaving frustrated gardeners with nothing to harvest after months of effort. Grandma Esperanza stopped growing uluco in 1955 when her family flat-out refused to eat it anymore, complaining that the slimy texture ruined every meal. She tried convincing them that it was traditional, that it was healthy, that it connected them to their Andean heritage, but none of that mattered when the tubers felt like eating boiled slugs. Without anyone willing to cook or consume uluco, she gave up and planted regular potatoes instead. By 1970, uluco had disappeared from American gardens entirely, surviving only in South America, where the slimy texture was accepted and even appreciated. The colorful, tangy tubers that once fed Grandma Esperanza's Christmas table were gone, killed by American texture preferences and climate incompatibility. Today, you can order uluco tubers online from specialty suppliers in Peru for $15 per pound, but good luck convincing anyone to eat them once they experience that mucilaginous slime coating their mouth. Stand in Grandma Sarah's Pacific Northwest garden in 1920 and watch her kneeling in the wet soil, carefully digging camas bulbs with a wooden stick, her hands moving slowly and deliberately through the earth. These Native American food plants grew wild across Washington and Oregon, covering meadows with stunning blue flowers every spring. But Grandma Sarah, who was half Nez Perce, also cultivated them in her garden, tending them like precious heirlooms. She'd dig the bulbs in fall after the blue flowers had faded and the plants had died back, leaving only dried stalks to mark where the bulbs hid underground. Each bulb was about the size of a small onion, with papery brown skin and white flesh inside, and she'd fill baskets with them, enough to feed her family through the winter. But here's the terrifying part. Camas bulbs looked almost identical to death camas, a poisonous plant that grew in the same meadows and bloomed around the same time. Death camas bulbs could kill you within hours, causing vomiting, convulsions, and respiratory failure. The only way to tell them apart was by the flowers. True camas had deep blue flowers, while death camas had white or pale cream flowers, but once the flowers were gone, even experienced foragers struggled to tell the difference. Grandma Sarah had learned from her mother and grandmother how to identify camas by the shape of the leaves, the smell of the bulbs, and the feel of the soil, but one mistake could be fatal. She never let anyone else dig camas without her supervision. Once harvested, the bulbs required 2 full days of pit roasting to become edible. Grandma Sarah would dig a fire pit in her backyard, line it with hot stones, layer the bulbs with wet moss and grass, then cover everything with dirt and let it cook for 48 hours. The slow roasting broke down the inulin in the bulbs and turned them dark brown, sticky, and intensely sweet like molasses or caramelized onions, with a deep, rich flavor that tasted almost like dessert. For Christmas, she'd serve the roasted camas bulbs as a traditional food, pulling apart the soft, sticky flesh and eating it with her fingers. The bulbs cost nothing to grow and fed her family of 8. But camas bulbs disappeared from American gardens by the 1932 for brutal reasons. First, Native American food traditions were actively suppressed by the U.S. government through forced assimilation policies that banned indigenous languages, ceremonies, and foodways. Children like Grandma Sarah's were sent to boarding schools where they were punished for speaking about traditional foods, and entire generations lost the knowledge of how to cultivate, harvest, and prepare camas safely. Second, white gardeners were absolutely terrified of the poisonous death camas look-alike. Even gardeners who wanted to grow camas were too afraid of accidentally killing their families, so they avoided it entirely. By 1940, camas cultivation had nearly vanished, and the knowledge of how to safely identify, harvest, and roast the bulbs was dying with the elders who still remembered. Grandma Sarah stopped growing camas in 1935 after her daughter refused to learn the tradition, saying it was too dangerous and too Indian for modern times. Today, camas bulbs grow wild in protected meadows, but almost nobody knows how to harvest or prepare them anymore. The sweet, molasses-flavored bulbs that fed native families for thousands of years are now a lost food, killed by cultural genocide and fear. Walk into Grandma Rebecca's Massachusetts garden in November 1925 and see her following a tangle of dried vines to their source, digging carefully through the cold soil to uncover chains of groundnut tubers strung together like beads on an underground necklace. This Native American vine had been growing wild in New England for thousands of years before European settlers arrived, and indigenous people, the Wampanoag, in particular, had cultivated and harvested it as a staple crop long before potatoes ever reached American soil. Grandma Rebecca, whose great-grandmother was Wampanoag, had learned to grow groundnuts as a child, and she planted them every spring by cutting up pieces of last year's tubers and burying them near her fence line, letting the vines climb up the wooden posts throughout the summer. By November, after the first frost had killed the vines, she'd dig along the roots and pull up chains of small tubers, each one about the size of a walnut or a small egg, connected by thin underground stems. A single vine could produce a dozen tubers, and Grandma Rebecca would dig them all winter long, pulling up enough to fill bushel baskets. She boiled the tubers like potatoes, their skins slipping off easily to reveal pale, starchy flesh inside. For Christmas, she roasted them in the oven with butter and salt until the outsides crisped and the insides turned soft and creamy. The tubers cost nothing after the initial planting, spread aggressively on their own, and fed her family of 6 all winter long. Groundnuts tasted like a cross between potatoes and beans, starchy and satisfying like potatoes, but with a rich, nutty, almost legume-like flavor that made them heartier and more filling. They had 3 times the protein of regular potatoes, which made them incredibly valuable for families who couldn't always afford meat. Grandma Rebecca's family loved them, but groundnuts disappeared from American gardens by the 1942, and the reasons were tragic and systemic. First, Native American crops like groundnuts, Jerusalem artichokes, and camas were deliberately abandoned in favor of European vegetables as part of broader cultural assimilation policies that erased indigenous foodways. Farming extension offices and seed companies promoted potatoes, carrots, and beans while ignoring native crops that had fed people for millennia. Second, the cultivation knowledge died with the generation that remembered it. Grandma Rebecca's children had no interest in learning to grow groundnuts. They saw them as Indian food, old-fashioned and embarrassing compared to modern store-bought vegetables. Grandma Rebecca stopped planting groundnuts in 1942 when her daughter told her to stop living in the past and grow normal food instead. She dug up the last of the tubers and let the vines die, and with them, a food tradition that had survived for thousands of years. By 1950, most Americans had never heard of groundnuts, and modern gardeners had no idea this native, high-protein tuber even existed. The starchy, nutty tubers that once sustained entire communities through harsh New England winters were gone, replaced by potatoes shipped in from Idaho, and vegetables that had no connection to the land they grew in. Today, groundnuts still grow wild along riverbanks and forest edges in the Northeast, but almost nobody knows they're edible, let alone how to cultivate them. The tubers that fed the Pilgrims during their first winter in America are now considered weeds, and the knowledge Grandma Rebecca carried has been lost to time. Stand in Grandma Winona's South Dakota garden in 1918 and watch her kneeling in the dry prairie soil, digging carefully around prairie turnip plants with a sharpened stick, her movements slow and precise to avoid breaking the long, thick taproot that stretched deep into the earth. These native plants grew wild across the Great Plains, their purple flowers dotting the grasslands every summer. But Grandma Winona, who was Lakota, also cultivated them in her garden, planting seeds she'd collected from wild plants and tending them like treasures. The prairie turnip had a massive taproot, sometimes as long as her forearm, shaped like a thick carrot or parsnip, and covered in tough brown skin. She'd dig the roots in fall after the plants had died back, spending hours excavating each one from the hard-packed soil, careful not to snap them in half. Once harvested, Grandma Winona would peel the roots, revealing pale yellow flesh inside, then slice them thin and lay them out on wooden racks to dry in the sun. The drying process took weeks, but it was essential. Dried prairie turnip roots could be stored for years without spoiling, making them one of the most important survival foods for plains tribes during harsh winters. The dried roots shriveled and hardened until they looked like twisted pieces of wood, and Grandma Winona would store them in leather bags hanging from the rafters of her cabin. For Christmas, she'd grind the dried roots into a fine flour using a stone mortar and pestle, mixing the flour with water to make a dough that she'd shape into flatbreads and bake over the fire. The bread tasted starchy and slightly sweet, with an earthy flavor that was part turnip, part bean, and entirely filling. She'd also boil whole dried roots until they softened and turned tender, serving them alongside venison or rabbit. The roots cost nothing to grow, required almost no care once planted, and fed her family of 7 all winter long. They were nutritious, protein-rich, and could sustain people through months of scarcity when other food ran out. But prairie turnips disappeared completely from American gardens by the 1932, and the reasons were deliberate and devastating. Native American food plants were systematically erased through government policies that forced indigenous people onto reservations, banned traditional farming practices, and replaced native crops with government-issued rations of white flour, lard, and canned beef. Children like Grandma Winona's were sent to boarding schools where they were punished for speaking their languages or mentioning traditional foods, and entire generations lost the knowledge of how to identify, cultivate, and prepare prairie turnips. White Americans never learned to grow or even recognize this important indigenous crop that had sustained Plains people for thousands of years. To settlers, prairie turnips were just weeds growing in fields that needed to be plowed under for wheat and corn. The cultivation knowledge, where to find the plants, when to harvest, how to dry and store the roots, died with the elders who remembered. And by 1940, prairie turnips had vanished from gardens entirely. Grandma Winona stopped digging prairie turnips in 1925, when government agents told her she was living like a savage and needed to grow civilized crops instead. She tried teaching her grandchildren how to recognize the plants in the wild, but they had no interest, ashamed of food they'd been taught to see as primitive and backwards. Today, prairie turnips still grow wild in scattered patches across the Great Plains, but almost nobody knows they're edible. The starchy, sweet roots that once made bread and sustained entire communities through winter are now invisible, and the knowledge of how to use them is nearly extinct, killed by cultural genocide, forced assimilation, and a country that valued European vegetables over the foods that had grown in this soil for thousands of years before white people ever arrived. 30 forgotten Christmas vegetables that American families used to grow in every garden. Every single one of them has disappeared from modern seed catalog, modern gardens, and modern knowledge. These weren't failures. These weren't vegetables that didn't work. These were perfectly good food plants that vanished because industrial agriculture, seed company, and changing cultural values decided what vegetables Americans should grow. Look at what we lost. European heirlooms like salsify, scorzonera, cardoon, skirret, Alexander's vegetables that immigrants brought from their homelands and grew to maintain connection to their heritage. Perennial vegetables like good King Henry, sea kale, Welsh onion, walking onion, sorrel, Jerusalem artichokes, plants that came back every year forever, producing food without replanting. Native American crops like camas, groundnuts, prairie turnips, indigenous food plants that sustained people for thousands of years before European vegetables arrived. These vegetables fed families through the Depression, through world wars, through hard times when grocery store vegetables were too expensive. They grew in every climate, produced food when other vegetables failed, stored all winter without refrigeration, and provided unique flavors that modern supermarket vegetables can't match. They represented food independence. When you grew these vegetables, you didn't need seed companies. You saved seed, divided roots, let plants multiply, and grew food forever from one initial planting. You didn't need stores. You didn't need industrial agriculture. You didn't need anyone's permission to feed your family. So why did they disappear? Because seed companies couldn't profit from perennial vegetables that multiplied forever. Because supermarkets wanted uniform vegetables that shipped well and looked identical. Because industrial agriculture needed vegetables that could be harvested mechanically and stored for months. Because cultural assimilation pressured immigrants to abandon their ethnic vegetables and grow American vegetables. Because Native American food plants were systematically erased as part of cultural genocide. Most of these vegetables aren't actually gone. Small heirloom seed companies still carry some. Specialty ethnic seed sellers have others. Native seed keeper networks preserve indigenous varieties. But they're invisible. They're not in regular seed catalog. They're not in garden centers. Most gardeners have never heard of them. The knowledge of how to grow them, how to cook them, why they matter, that knowledge is dying with the last generation who remembers. These 30 vegetables need to return to American gardens. Not because they're better than modern vegetables, not because we should abandon everything new, but because garden diversity matters, because food independence matters, because cultural heritage matters, because having vegetables that multiply forever without buying new seeds every year matters. These vegetables represent what we lost when we let corporations decide what food we should grow. They represent the garden diversity that sustained families for generations. They represent immigrant heritage, indigenous knowledge, and self-sufficiency. They represent the possibility of growing food that doesn't require participating in industrial agriculture. 30 forgotten Christmas vegetables that American families grew. They're not forgot because they weren't good enough. They're forgotten because we were told to forget them by government policies that erased native foodways, by seed companies that chose profit over diversity, by cultural shifts that valued convenience over heritage, and by a food system that decided only a handful of vegetables deserved to survive. These vegetables fed families through depressions, droughts, and wars. They grew in climates where nothing else would. They cost nothing and asked for little, but we abandoned them for supermarket produce that travels thousands of miles and tastes like nothing. They're waiting in small seed collections, in heirloom catalogs, in native seed networks,